Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Launis and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. And we are continuing the series where I'm presenting the games suggested to me by my chess players' Facebook friends. Until now, we had grandmasters that, although they accepted my Facebook friendship, I have not yet met them in person. And I'm glad that, in spite of that, they accepted my friendship request and they also had games to suggest for me. Today we are switching gears. Instead of Grandmaster, we're going to have an international master, and it's someone that I know in person, and many people, I believe, they also know him. His name is Jay Bonin from the United States, and what I've heard is that he's played more official rated chess games than anybody else in the United States and perhaps in the whole world. This game took place in the year 2016 and his opponent was Edward Frumkin. When they played, Jay Bonin's FIDE rating was 2271 versus 1950 for Edward. Let me repeat, 1950 yes for Edward Frumkin. This means that Jay Bonin was really the favorite. Currently, their ratings have fallen a little bit. Many people's ratings have fallen because there's been enormous progress in chess and you need to improve significantly in order to just keep the same rating. J. Bonin currently has 2166 and Edward Frumkin has 1773. As I mentioned before, the game took place in New York City. It was part of the Edward Last Memorial, and we are going now to share my screen and look at the moves. How did this game go? Repeat once again, on the right part of the screen, you'll see the computer analysis. Every move, the computer is going to tell you if it was the best or not. If not, which would have been the best move. Who is ahead? Positive number with a plus means white is ahead. Negative number with a minus means that black is ahead. And also, once every player has played, you can see the three best possible options for the opponent. Edward Frumkin had the white pieces and Jay Bonin had the black. Edward Frumkin starts the standard way that most players start with a pawn from e2 to e4, and Jay Bonin replies by sending his knight from b8 to c6. This is called the ninja defense. You can see it here. Second move for Edward Frumkin is the knight goes to c3 and still win the book. And now Jay Bonin will deviate from the book. He will play a move that is, I would say, quite surprising, because you're not supposed to play the same piece twice in the opening unless it's attacked or unless you have a good reason why not. So what Jay will do is send his knight to d4. The knight is having a nice position in the center. The computer says it's good, but not the best. But of course, there it is not very stable. It's not protected at all. And Edward sends his bishop to c4. And Jay now develops with a really opening move. The pawn goes to e6 and thus gives space for his bishop at f8. Edward sends his bishop at f3, threatening the knight at d4. If J takes a knight, then you understand the queen takes the knight and the queen has a nice square. If J sends the knight back, for example, to c6, basically he wasted two moves. Instead, what he did is defend his knight by sending the pawn to c5. Edward continues developing, sending the pawn to d3, and J now sends his knight to e7. Edward castles kingside, and J sends his knight from e7 to c6. Pawn goes to a3. You see here that if you look at the scores, the computer evaluation, white has a very small advantage. For the time being, that's not so important. Bishop goes to e7. And here Edward sends his rook to e1. The computer thinks it's good, but not good enough, and that's why we have a negative number. Black has advantage, even though it's a very small, by 0.24. J Bonin will castle. And now we change the knights. Knight goes from f3 to d4, so Edward takes J's knight. There are two ways to take it back, either with the knight or with the pawn. And J decides to take it to the pawn and attacking the knight at c3, which has to move. J will push his pawn to b6. By doing so, of course, he gives some freedom to his bishop at c8. We completed the first 10 moves. The score is more or less even. White has a plus 0.3, 0.4 advantage. That is usually the advantage that White has from the fact that they start first. Edward will take a little bit more space by sending his pawn to b4. Fianchetto for J, bishop to b7. Fianchetto also for Edward, bishop to b2. And now J makes a serious decision. Pawn goes to f5. I mentioned it's serious because, in fact, if anything, the computer thinks it's inaccuracy. I say it's serious before even I saw the evaluation, because pawns don't go back, and the diagonal from a2 to g8 becomes weaker with the white bishop being on c4. The pawn at e6 is pinned, so one does not push these pawns lightly. Now, white has an advantage of 0.87. Not that great, but little by little starts being significant. But let's see how the game will continue. Edward takes the pawn at d4, change at d4, and J's pawn from f5 takes to e4. Edward takes back from e3 to e4, and bishop goes to d6 for black. You see that from d6, the bishop is threatening h2. For the time being, it doesn't have support, but if it had, for example, if there was a queen at h4, that would be wonderful to grab the pawn at h2, at least threaten that and weaken the king. Because even if white could defend by sending the pawn to g3, this starts weakening white king's cover. But the problem is, look at that, that the bishop on d6 is undefended, and there's a queen on d1. If it was me, I would think of sending my bishop to g7, take the pawn, and after it's taken, I'm taking the bishop at d6. Now I'm ahead by a pawn. Of course, most likely, black will not be so collaborating, so helpful. Most likely, black would take the pawn on h2. Check and then take, so I don't lose material, but still the thing's exposed. That's what would have come to my mind at point. I'm not sure if I would have played it. I'm only saying this would have been the first move that you would analyze. We have, unfortunately, we don't have the notes from any of the players, and all we have is the score of the game. That's why I need to use my own thoughts and imaginations, which, with my rating of 1572, they are way below these or any of the other players you're going to see in this series. White sends a queen to g4. Black sends queen to e7. Why? There was the threat of checkmate. Look at the pawn at g7. If black would not defend one way or the other, white would checkmate immediately. And the way to defend is either queen goes to e7. Yes, queen can go to f6 and defend, but then it's lost from the bishop. Or if the rook goes to f7. Or maybe if the pawn goes to e5, but this, although it gains the tempo because it attacks the pawn on d4, on the long term, it's going to block the black's dark color bishop. White wants to start pushing the pawns. Pawn goes to g3. Rook goes to f7 for black. So the square at g7 is defended twice. But at this point, we've reached white having an enormous advantage of 2.17. I'm going to go back a little bit and see where did this big margin develop. Because until now, I have less than 1 for white. Yes, f takes to e4 is a mistake according to the computer. And move number 14 is where white really has an advantage of 1.99. Queen to e7 is a good move, but with black being down, the difference becomes even larger, passes the 2-point mark. And we're now, as I mentioned, 2.17 ahead for white, meaning after 17 moves, white has a big advantage. Let's continue now. Move number 19, pawn goes to f4 for white. White tries to start pushing the pawns, but the computer thinks a mistake. Why it's a mistake? Because there's a diagonal from g1 to a7 that is where the white king is located. For the time being, there's a bishop on d4, but if this bishop goes away, white king may be in danger. And in chess, sometimes, even though something might cause you danger in the future, if possible, better avoid it, because if you have too many threats to act against, you can be in a very bad shape. Better avoid any potential threats if possible. What is black going to do? You see now that white's advantage went down from 2.30 to 0.18. White is barely ahead. Black will take a move that the computer thinks is brilliant. Bishop takes to b4. Why is it brilliant? Because black sacrifices a bishop for a pawn with no, in fact, for 2 pawns if white takes it, with no concrete advantage. Black attacks the rook on e1. The computer says the best move for white is take the bishop with the a pawn. Then the queen will take at b4. So black has won 2 pawns for the bishop and has a very strong attack. But white perhaps was a little bit suspicious. If you have someone much stronger than you sacrificing a piece, usually you know it's not a mistake. Black was afraid if queen goes to b4, it attacks the bishop on c4. If the bishop leaves, it attacks the bishop on d4. Not so easy to defend both. Bishop maybe if queen goes to e2. Rook goes to c8. You see here the whole line according to the computer as it going. To c8, white goes to a7, queen takes at c4. So at this point, really, and after the exchange of the queens, black is the better shape. And they'll exchange queens, and black will be a pawn ahead, if it goes according to plan. White, I'm not sure if Edward really did all these calculations or not. He thought it's better not to accept the sacrifice. And sometimes when you play players stronger than you, and they suddenly sacrifice a piece, it may be a good idea to avoid taking the piece if you can think of anything better. What does Edward do instead? Pawn goes to f5, continues the attack on the king side. The computer says it is a blunder. So now blacks, for the first time ever in the game, move number 19 is ahead by 1.45. How does black reply? Now that he saved his bishop was not taking, he was really to save it, goes to c5. Now you see what's happening. The bishop at d4 is pinned, so what can white do? Maybe exchange bishops, but then queen is checking, and next move takes the bishop at c4. Perhaps send the bishop back to f2, or cover it with the rook on d1, the queen on e1. Instead, Edward decided to push his pawn on c3, and now we exchange bishops, and really that was the best move. White has two pawns in the center, that's great. But white's king is exposed. Look at the safety of the two kings. Black's king has two pawns, c7, h7 in front. The darker bishop is not here any longer to threaten g7. While white's king has a pawn on h2, and other than that is very much uncovered. We are now move number 21. We finish at 20 moves, and let's see how the game will continue. Queen goes to d6, threatening the pawn on d4, and with a check, not only that, and then bishop is lost. So white avoids it by placing the rook on d1. Rook goes to e8 for black. Now the game is even. White has lost a significant advantage, and it seems that black doesn't have that much of advantage or anything. White is still ahead, but by very little. Rook goes to d3. King goes to h8. Most likely to avoid pinning the rook at f7 if the pawn on e6 is moved. Bishop goes to a2 for white. Blunders is a computer. I don't think that the move itself is bad. It's only a complete waste at a crucial moment. And now you see that black has a significant advantage of 1.81. The computer would rather have the queen go to h5 and continue the attack. Black's rook goes to f8. Change pawns on e6. Once again, black cannot keep his advantage for too long. It's just 0.20. And we continue the first 25 moves. You see, the game is even, but well, it had a few ups and downs. Mostly white was ahead sometimes, then black in 2 or 3 mistakes of blunders of white. And let's continue. Rook goes to c1 to occupy the open file. Good idea. The computer says inaccuracy. Well, occupying open files in general is correct. Perhaps I would have done the same thing. Why not have my rook in an open file? Bishop goes to a6 for black. And black attacks the rook on d3. How will white respond? If you see the computer says the only move that keeps white not too much behind is to push the pawn to e5, threatening the queen. Usually that's not the first thought in your mind. Sometimes if you are facing an attack, you can reply, as I say, danger level, meaning creating a bigger threat for your opponent. So while they deal with a bigger threat, then you have time to solve your smaller threat. Sometimes it works, sometimes not. But Edward decided to directly save his rook, sending it to d1. And the computer says this is a blunder. Now black has a significant advantage. At move 27, black is ahead by 4.35. What does black do? First of all, grab the pawn on a3. And white wants to take the pawn back and save the bishop by sending it to e6. Inaccuracy is a computer, and you're already down by more than 4. Now you're down by more than 6. 6.19 for black. Of course, white cannot take the bishop because then black cannot take the white bishop because then the black rook is lost. Instead, black deals with the check 23, and king goes to h1. In fact, the king has nowhere else. Oh no, he can go also to g2, either g2 or h1. G2, the problem is that rook can go to g2 and the great attack much stronger. That's why Edward sends his king on h1. And now finally, J places his bishop on e2. And here is what Weiss is facing. First of all, a double threat. Both his rook on d1 and his queen on g4 are under attack. Also, the queen needs to protect the bishop on e6. Perhaps the only move would have been for queen to go to h3, at least the only one that directly faces the threats. The computer suggests that the rook goes to c3, and then queen to f2, and really we're very near mate because the king doesn't have too many squares to go. Of course, if the rook goes here, the king can also go to g2, but there's another rook and so on. So really, white is in a very precarious situation. That's why at this point, Edward Frumkin decided to resign and Jay Bonin won the game. We're going now to see the total computer evaluation of the game. I'm not going to play any of these moves because I want when the computer analyzes the score not to consider these moves. Consider only the moves that were actually played. Maybe we can try it later. $78.4 for Edward Frumkin, 85.6 for J. Bonin. Both of them are below the 90s that were used with the Grandmasters. And rating-wise, J. Bonin played for 2300, the rating of 2300, which is of course above, a little bit above his rating at the time of 2271, while Edward Frumkin played 1950, exactly the rating that he had. Let's go to the categories. One brilliant move for J. Bonin when his bishop took the pawn at b4. One great also. I think it was when the queen took the pawn at a3 late in the game. Best moves, 12 versus 9 for Edward. Excellent, 7 versus 4 for Jay. Good, 4 versus 3 for Edward. Book. You see the players left the book quite early. Forget about move number 11 like a few games before. Two book moves for Edward, one for Jay, and move number 2, he left the book. Inaccuracies, 2 for Edward, 3 for J. Mistakes, 3 for Edward, 1 for J. Misses, 3 for J. And blunders, 2 for Edward. Let's see if we can go back and see what the computer would suggest for the end. Why did you see it on your screen? What will happen if the players insisted on playing the follow-up? And really here there have been a much better situation of black would be way ahead. Black would have a queen for a bishop. That concludes a presenting of this game of Jay. And now let me tell you a few things about Jay Bonin. I first met him in 1999 when he was the tournament director at the Manhattan Chess Club. Later on, I would see him playing in rated games, and not only that, he would present his lectures on Sunday mornings, usually on the last day of tournaments. He would provide free lectures just before the last two rounds would start. and the audience would love to listen to them. I even remember myself once a question I asked him about how to deal when white sends a pawn to c5. This was a move that when white played and I had black would usually be my end. I would be suffocated, but the reply he gave me was one that I would use later, and at least in one game, this was the reason why I was able to win a game. Bonin continues playing at the Queen's Chess Club on Fridays. I think, if I'm correct, recently I faced him once and I presented the game I had with him. This concludes this video of Bonin. In fact, Bonin was the one that suggested that we become Facebook friends, and from that point on, after he accepted my friendship, I started having many other great chess players as friends, and this series became possible. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching this video. Thanks to the viewers, thanks to the subscribers, thanks to the ones of you that click the like button. We'll continue with more of these videos. That's it for now, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Harry Lasaniziris. This is my Greco Chess YouTube channel. Goodbye.